I still see it when I close my eyes, a small figurine, no taller than my thumb, sitting on a flat stone under a soft blue glow. It looked hand-carved, smoothed by time and touch, as if it had been waiting in the dark for someone to find it. The air around it felt colder than the rest of the cave, the way a refrigerator feels when you open the door at night. Let me know where you're listening from and share this if you believe remembering is the first step toward justice. The summer of 2005 came on hot and simple. In Escalante, mornings started cool enough to see your breath if you were up at 5, but by noon the heat pressed down 40 feet of sky that wouldn't blink. We lived by the sound of our own routines, tires on gravel dogs, barking from shaded porches, the thump of an old screen door. I had already turned in my badge that spring, but still sat a few days a week at the visitor desk to help with permits and answer the same questions I'd been asked for 30 years. How much water is enough? How quick do the slot canyons flood? Which map won't get me lost? My wife Beth kept a citrus-scented candle near the coffee maker in our kitchen, the kind that makes a room feel cleaner than it is. Most mornings I'd drive in on the county road before the sun popped up over the mesa. The office was a low building with a metal roof that pinged when it heated. The flag cracked in the wind. The thermometer outside the door liked to stick at 96 degrees by 3 in the afternoon. Ranger Owen Calder and I would split the day he handled field calls while I smiled through the questions and stamped itineraries. On the Friday they came through, I was teasing a cussed paper jam out of the copier. 6 young folks walked in with dust on their boots, but that fresh, try-anything look on their faces. Serena Hale led the way, polite as a schoolteacher, a camera strap across her shoulder and a small notebook in her hand. She asked if she could photograph a trail map for reference, and I told her to buy the actual map. Ink fades in heat, I said, and paper's kinder in a storm. She smiled, wrote "buy map" on her pad, and did exactly that. Jasper Kane did most of the talking. He kept one hand on a folded topo like it was a steering wheel he didn't want to let go of. He said they had 3 days planned down a sidewash through a set of narrows camp on a bench with a good view of the stars, then loop back out to the road. GPS spare batteries, 2 gallons of water, each iodine drops. He slid their permit fee across the counter without me asking. Miles Reddick pointed at the rack of brochures on the wall and asked which pie at the cafe in town was worth the calories. "Pecan," I told him. "Get it warm, ask for ice cream." He laughed, a loose, easy sound that made the other hikers smile. Declan Voss lingered in the background, looking through the glass door at the white sun on the parking lot, fingers at his camera like it was a nervous tell. Leah Thorne retaped her ankle on the bench with practiced hands, then repacked her kit with a neatness I wished we could issue. Nora Blake asked careful questions about respecting rock art. No chalk, no touching, no rubbing. I liked her immediately. The room smelled like dust and sunscreen. A fly tapped the window near the door, the way they do when they want out. I ran them through the same points I always did. Flash floods don't ask permission. The canyon floor rises faster than you think. Pack out every scrap, even the stuff with edges that look clean. Leave a return time with us and with someone who loves you enough to nag you about it. They listen the way adults do when they've already chosen their line, but are decent enough to let an old ranger finish his speech. They paid, signed, and stepped back out into the white light. I watched them cross the lot, load their packs by a dusty SUV with Colorado plates, and roll away toward Hole in the Rock Road, a straight ribbon that hums in the summer like a hot wire. I marked their names and the expected return hour on the clipboard, then set it under the radio. The radio coughed static and then settled into that low, warm hum I'd heard since the 70s. Around here, the days have a rhythm, tourists early, heat middle, locals late. After lunch, I drove out to check a cattle gate, where folks sometimes squeeze through without meaning to. A hawk swung lazy circles overhead. At the pull-off by Dry Fork, I ran into Jimmy Lott from the gas station, who told me he'd topped off a group of college kids that morning. Bought 3 bags of ice and a box of granola bars, he said, pointing his thumb toward the far mesa. Good manners. They said thank you. I figured it was the same 6. People stick in your mind by the small things, not the big ones. That evening, Beth and I ate chicken salad and watched the light get soft on the red rock, while the neighbor's porch fan clicked every time it circled. We talked about the choir she sings alto, and about Marion Hale's bake sale for the school fundraiser. Marion lives 2 streets over. She and Beth sort canned goods together at the church pantry twice a month. We didn't know then that Marion's daughter had signed that permit across from me. Escalante is small, but threads can lay quiet for years before you notice how they cross. Saturday came hot and dull. By 10, the road shimmered and the parking lot smelled faintly of rubber. A thunderhead rose over the Henry Mountains, big and bright like piled meringue. It's a familiar dance in July storms, flirt with the high country, toss a few grumbles over the flats, then drift off to make trouble somewhere else. I watched that cloud while I wiped down the counter and restocked maps. Owen came in around noon, face ruddy from the field, and dropped his hat on the rack. "Monsoon looks like it wants to wake up," he said. We checked the forecast together. Chance of afternoon cells, nothing guaranteed. The kind of line that makes you nod and plan anyway. Mid-afternoon, Marion stopped in with 2 bags of canned beans for the pantry drive. She asked me about the state of the roads, saying a friend's niece was camping out past the cattle guard. We swapped weather stories, everybody has them, and she laughed about the time her cousin tried to drive a sedan into a wash and needed half the town to pull him out. She set the beans on the bench and wrote her name on the donation sheet in tidy loops. "You need anything for the office?" she asked. "We're fine," I said. "Maybe a cooler of ice if this heat keeps up." She promised to bring one soon and left with a wave, the door's little bell giving that single polite chime. Late day, a gust front rolled dust across the highway and spit a few fat drops that smacked the sidewalk dark circles that dried before I could finish remarking on them. The storm wandered east, grumbling at no one. I closed the window shades halfway to keep the late light from turning the front desk into an oven. Owen headed out to check a trailhead sign that liked to get blown crooked, and I took a call from a couple asking if their dog could handle a 2-mile wash hike in 95 degrees heat. Carry more water than you think, I said. If the dog wants shade, the dog wins. Evenings in Escalante cool fast once the sun falls behind the stone. Porch lights flick on one by one like a string of camp lanterns. You smell creosote if you're lucky, and fried onions if you're luckier. The diner put a special on the board meatloaf with brown gravy, and guys in oil-stained caps took the counter stools they've sat on for decades. In the office, the radio fanned its steady static while I filled out a maintenance request for the temperamental copier. I penciled in the next week's volunteer schedule, drew a small star beside Owen's name for 2 long field days, and told myself I'd finally oil the door hinges on Monday. When I think of that weekend now, I remember a string of small sounds, a fly ticking the window, the softer than you'd expect thud of the stamp on a permit, the quick spring of Leah's tape as she tore a fresh strip. I remember the easy way Miles leaned against the counter and asked about pie, the way Nora held eye contact when she asked about petroglyphs, the way Jasper measured his words and looked to the others before he spoke for the group. I remember Serena's handwriting, neat, spaced, no cursive when she wrote BIMAP and underlined it. There were tiny things that didn't register as odd at the time. Jasper's old paper map had one corner repaired with clear tape that had yellowed like it had seen more summers than he had. Declan's lens cap flicked off and on, as if he couldn't decide whether to keep looking through glass or use his eyes alone. Leah tugged her laces one more time after she'd already double-knotted them, an extra tug that said she didn't trust old ankles to behave. And Serena, when she handed me the permit to sign, hesitated just a blink too long, as if she meant to ask another question, and decided against it. Sunday slid by with the same easy stride, morning cool, afternoon shimmer, evening quiet. I watered the small ash tree behind the office with a kinked garden hose and watched the runoff darken the dust before it disappeared. I checked the clipboard more than I needed to, not because I was worried habit is its own kind of comfort, but because I like to know where folks are when the heat piles up on the land that way. Owen texted a photo of a coyote trotting the shoulder of the road at dusk, head low tail level, like a thin gray thought passing through. I told him I'd meet him early Monday to look at a fence line near the river. The 6 were due to check back by late afternoon on Monday. It was written in my own hand in the same ink I use for grocery lists and birthdays, Cane Party ETA 1800. If groups come out early, they usually swing by for bathrooms, and cold water tell you what they saw, brag about the night sky. Sometimes they're late, People misjudge mileage, linger for a better photograph, sit in the shade, and stretch out a blister. Out here, an hour either way is nothing to fret about. But that Sunday night, just after 9, I stood outside the office with my hands in my pockets and counted 3 cars drift by, none of them the dusty Colorado SUV. The town settled down the way it always does. One porch light switched off, then another, then another. I locked the office door and listened for a moment to the air conditioner finally stop its drone. The clipboard lay on the counter beneath the radio, a squared-off edge aligned with the wood grain, because I like things neat. Somewhere far off, heat lightning blinked over the horizon, silent at this distance, just a pulse of white behind the rock. I left the porch light on at the office that night, a small pool of yellow on the concrete by the door, because folks sometimes roll in late after a long day, and it's good to see where you're headed. I told myself they'd pass that light on Monday, wave through the glass, and ask where to find pecan pie. But as I drove home, the highway felt emptier than usual, and in the rear view, the office light looked like an eye that didn't want to close. That night, after I locked the office, the sky went violet over the mesas, and the heat let go like a held breath. The porch light hummed behind me as I headed home, a yellow island in the dark. I remember thinking I'd see that Colorado SUV by morning, streaked with dust, its passengers red-eyed, but laughing about the hike that ran long. But Monday came and went, and the road stayed empty. By late afternoon, Owen radioed from the ridge to ask if the cane party had checked out yet. I told him no, but I wasn't worried, at least not then. Folks come back late all the time. Sometimes they get turned around, sometimes they sit too long in the shade waiting for the rock to cool. Still, as I straightened the clipboard on the counter, a small thought pressed behind my ribs. The sun goes down quick in those canyons. By the next morning, the families were calling. First it was a brother from Denver, then Marion Hale herself, her voice rough with the kind of fear that comes from not wanting to sound afraid. "They should have been back yesterday," she said. "Serena always calls me even if it's late. I promised her we'd start a check, that it was probably nothing." I could hear the silence on the other end, just breathing, maybe praying. After I hung up, I drove out to the trailhead myself. The SUV was right where they'd left it, sun-baked and streaked white from dust. Windows rolled up, maps still folded on the dash. No footprints leading away, just the hard crust of old tracks fading into the wash. Owen met me there, squinting under his hat. "Could have headed out the back route," he said, but we both knew there wasn't one. He kicked at a tire, looked at the empty horizon. We opened the doors inside, smelled of hot vinyl and forgotten water bottles. Everything was neat, too neat, like they'd meant to be back by sundown. I jotted their plate number, time, and the GPS coordinate on the back of a weather log. When I called it in, dispatch patched me to Garfield County. Detective Marcus Clean picked up. I knew his voice, low, rough from coffee, and chew the sound of someone who's seen too many simple trips turn wrong. By noon, the first helicopter was in the air. The blades carved the heat, sending sand spinning like mist. I stayed on the ground crew, scanning every dry arroyo, every shaded crevice. The Escalante can fool you. It looks wide open, but the land folds in on itself. There are places where you can walk 20 feet from a man and never see him again. We found a boot print near a seep, half washed out by an old flash flood, but nothing else. No gear, no sign of a campsite. It was as if the earth had swallowed them whole. The second day, the dogs came in. German shepherds, noses down, tails cutting the air. They caught something faint at first, a drift of scent that led into the narrows but died where the canyon pinched tight. The rock there rises shoulder to shoulder, smooth as glass. No tracks, no drag marks, just wind and silence. At dusk, I stood by the trucks watching the sky turn from orange to blood red to nothing. Owen lit a lantern, its light shaking against the rock. "We'll go again, at first light," he said. We always said that like it was a promise we could keep. The third day brought heat close to 104 degree F. No clouds, no wind. The chopper teams reported a faint glint deep in a side canyon, maybe metal, maybe just wet rock. We rappelled down, hearts thudding from both heat and hope. The glint turned out to be an old mylar wrapper caught in a bush, faded blue, long torn. I pocketed it anyway. Out here you collect what you can. That evening we called the families. Marion came down in person. I met her outside the command tent, her hands gripping a photograph like she was afraid to crease it. "She's strong," she said, trying to convince herself more than me. "Serena knows how to handle herself." I nodded but said nothing. Sometimes silence is the only kindness you can offer. After a week, the search grew heavy with the smell of diesel and dust. Reporters started showing up asking about storms, about sinkholes. One young guy with a microphone asked if I believed in miracles. I told him I believed in water and shade and people who wait too long to find either. By the 10th day, the official operation scaled back. Helicopters moved on to other emergencies. Families stayed at the motel on Main Street, taking turns standing by the ranger station phone, waiting for news that never came. On the 14th day, we called it what it was, a recovery, not a rescue. The words landed like stones. 2 summers passed like that. Reports filed, hopes thinned, time eroding sharp edges into something dull and sore. The SUV was towed, tagged, and stored at impound. I kept their permit in my drawer, couldn't bring myself to file it away. Every few months, Marion would stop by the office with cookies for the team, still asking if we'd heard anything new. She never cried in front of us, but her eyes carried that dry shine of someone who had. The desert went on doing what it always does, burning hot by day, whispering cold by night, keeping its own counsel. Then, in mid-July of 2007, the call came through the county dispatch. A woman had stumbled out of a canyon 30 miles east of where we'd been searching, malnourished, dehydrated, barely conscious. The deputy's voice over the radio was tight. "She says her name's Serena," he told me. For a second, I thought I'd misheard. The name cut through the static like a blade. Within an hour, the hospital in Salt Lake confirmed it. Serena Hale, 25 years old, alive after 2 years missing. I drove up that night. The highway shimmered with heat even after sundown. At the hospital, the halls smelled like antiseptic and machine air. The nurses were kind but guarded. Reporters had already begun circling. Through a glass pane, I saw her, a thin figure in a hospital gown, eye-line taped to her arm, eyes wide but focused. Her mother sat at her bedside, holding her hand like she might float away. When I stepped in, Marion rose to hug me, shaking so hard I could feel her heartbeat through my shirt. Serena looked at me, trying to place the face the uniform. "You stamped our permit," she whispered. Her voice sounded dry as paper. I told her yes, I had. Then she said, "They're still down there." Detective Clean arrived before dawn. We sat together in the waiting room with 2 cups of vending machine coffee. He rubbed his jaw, said she'd been talking about creatures in the cave, things that watched them. "She's coherent," he added, "but she's been through hell." I asked if she'd said where. He shook his head. "Somewhere off the main route. She's trying to draw it out. The doctor said her body showed signs of long exposure, old fractures, malnutrition scars like scratches. Whatever happened, it hadn't been quick." Later that morning, when Serena was strong enough to speak again, I stood in the corner while Clean asked his questions. Her words came haltingly, but the pictures they painted were clear enough. A hidden cave behind a rockfall, narrow at first, widening into dark chambers. They went in to explore the ground, gave way, and they fell into a lower level. She described nights lit only by dying flashlights, food running out, water filtered through cracks in the stone. And then she told us they weren't alone, that shapes moved in the tunnels, tall and silent, watching from the edges of the light. She said those beings brought them food, roots, insects, and kept them alive, but never let them leave. Clean's pencil stopped moving. "What were they protecting?" he asked. Serena's eyes filled her gaze far away. "Something old," she said softly. "Something they guard." The nurse stepped in, signaled. That was enough for the day. As we left the room, the hallway lights flickered, once a small, harmless thing, but it made my skin crawl all the same. News spread before we could stop it. The word survivor hit headlines by noon. Families who had made peace with loss were suddenly pulled back into waiting. Within 48 hours, a new search team formed, rangers, cavers, and a handful of scientists from the state university. I returned to Escalante to help coordinate ground access. Owen met me at the old trailhead, eyes narrowed against the wind. "We're doing this again?" he asked. I told him we were, but this time with better maps. We started where Serena's rough sketches pointed a remote branch canyon lined with hoodoos and boulder piles. It looked like every other stretch of sandstone until the third day when the light caught something behind a spill of rock, a thin vertical gap where shadows pooled deeper than they should. Owen slipped his hand inside, first, feeling cool air rising. "That's a draft," he said. We cleared rubble until the opening was wide enough for a man to slide through. Inside smelled of wet dust and minerals air older than our own. I followed last the beam of my headlamp slicing across rough walls, etched with faint grooves. The sound changed down there, no echo, just a soft pressure, as if the stone absorbed our breath. 100 feet in, we found what was left of a campsite, a torn scrap of fabric, a rusted buckle, part of a plastic bottle melted from time. I recognized the brand. We'd stocked the same kind at the visitor shop. Nearby, a few scattered bones, small and light. Owen crouched, his gloved hands trembling as he brushed sand away. Human by the look of it, though, fragile from decay. We marked the spot, called it in. The others waited in silence, the only sound our breathing. When we climbed back out, the sun had dropped below the rim, painting the rock blood red. I stood at the mouth of that cave, the same wind rising that had greeted me the day they disappeared, and I felt the land staring back. For 2 years the desert had kept its secret. Now it was whispering it out inch by inch. Serena was safe above ground, but her words haunted every step we took. If what she said was true, then those caves weren't empty, and somewhere in that dark, we still had company. We sealed the entrance for the night, posted a watch, and set up a temporary camp on the ridge. The radio crackled with updates from the lab in Salt Lake. They'd run preliminary tests on the bone fragments, and fabric confirmed age and human origin. Clean wanted a full team in by morning. Owen sat beside the fire, silent eyes on the canyon below. I remember him saying almost to himself, "I've been here 30 years. Thought I knew every corner of this land. Turns out it's been watching us, not the other way around." The fire burned low, throwing sparks into the wind. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called long, steady, almost human. None of us said a word. The desert doesn't give up its stories easily, and what it had begun to tell us that night felt bigger than anything a man could fit into words. We only knew one thing for sure: the darkness down there wasn't done with us yet. That first night on the ridge, none of us really slept. The wind moved through the rocks like water, soft but constant, carrying a low hum that got inside your head. Every so often a pebble rolled from somewhere up high and bounced once against the sandstone. You told yourself it was the wind, but the sound of it, slow, deliberate, made you question the things you thought you knew about silence. By dawn, Owen poured us each a cup of coffee from the battered steel pot he kept in his pack. The air smelled like burnt grounds and damp rock. No one said much. We just stared at that narrow opening below us, waiting for the light to hit it again. The second team arrived mid-morning, led by Detective Clean, with a few cavers from the National Speleological Society and a young geologist named Theo Blake Nova's older brother. He looked like a man holding himself together by force of will. He'd read Serena's statements the night before, every word about the tunnels, the creatures, the hidden chamber. He didn't believe any of it, not yet, but he believed his sister might still be down there, and that was enough. I helped him rig his line to the anchor bolts, his hands shaking so hard the carabiner clicked twice before he caught it. When the sun crested the rim, the canyon lit up in layers of red and gold. You could see the heat start to rise off the stone like thin smoke. We descended slow, one by one, until the light faded behind us and the rock swallowed the day. Inside, the air turned cold, heavy with the smell of wet clay and minerals. Every sound, our boots scraping our ropes, knocking the wall, came back twice, once in echo, once in vibration like the cave itself was breathing with us. We followed the first passage until it opened into a wide chamber, the one Serena had mentioned. There, scattered in the dust, were things no storm could have arranged: bits of torn clothing, a half-buried buckle, a cracked water bottle flattened by time. I knelt and brushed away a thin layer of grit. The brand was one I recognized from the supply shelf at the visitor center. Same batch we sold that summer. Owen crouched beside me, his lamp catching on something white. At first I thought it was a piece of bone washed in from somewhere, but when he pulled the brush across it, the shape told its own story. 2 femurs, small and fragile. The color had gone the shade of old paper. He didn't have to say it. We both knew. He set his hat over the spot until the forensics team could mark it. After a while, you stop pretending this work gets easier. You just learn how to fold it into the parts of yourself that already ache. The chamber walls held Mark's drawings maybe, but rough and uneven. Long lines that curved into shape stick figures beside larger forms that looked almost human, but not quite. Some of the lines were smeared by moisture, others carved deep as if with stone tools. Theo moved closer, his flashlight tracing the grooves. "She drew these," he said quietly. Nova had a habit of leaving messages when she got nervous, but the lines didn't look like her work to me. They were older, the edges softened by time. It felt like we were standing inside a language no one had spoken in 1,000 years. Then we heard it. A low rumble from somewhere deeper in the rock, too steady to be our own movement. The kind of sound that doesn't echo, it just rolls through the air and stops your breath. Everyone froze. The geologist switched off his lamp, and for one long heartbeat, the cave went completely dark. When he turned it back on, the noise had stopped. No one said a word after that. Owen signaled to pull back to base, and we obeyed. Back on the ridge, Clean called for a forensic sweep. The team spent the evening cataloging what we'd found, the fabric scraps, the bones, the drawings. The lab tent buzzed with low conversation and the occasional scrape of a scalpel on sample glass. Late in the night, one of the biologists, a woman from Utah State named Dr. Patel, came over holding a swab tube. "There's something strange in the soil samples," she said. "Microbial DNA we can't classify yet. Could be contamination, but—" Her voice trailed off. None of us needed her to finish. This place was already rewriting the rules we'd come in with. The next morning, news trucks lined the road into Escalante. You could hear them long before you saw them, the idle hum of generators, the distant click of camera shutters. Someone had leaked that remains were found. Families started arriving again, older now, wearier still, clinging to a hope that shifted every time we spoke. Jasper's mother came first, a frail woman named Etta who walked with a cane. She clutched a framed photo to her chest as if it were oxygen. "Don't keep him down there too long," she said. "Bring him home. I promised we would try. That word try has a way of hurting more than it helps." Over the next few days, the search turned methodical. We mapped each tunnel branch, every offshoot, every dead end. Theo joined us underground despite our protests, claiming he knew his sister's habits that he could tell which path she'd have taken. At one point, about 300 feet in, he stopped and shined his light at a patch of mud pressed with something unusual footprints but wider than ours, the toes splayed differently longer. I measured one with my hand. About 13 inches, maybe more. The stride between them was uneven, like whoever or whatever made them limped or carried weight wrong. No one spoke, but you could feel the unease moving through the group like static. By the 4th day, the caves began to change. The passages widened, air growing damp and cooler. The walls shimmered with a thin film of moisture that caught our lights like glass. And then we stepped into a chamber, unlike the rest, a dome, maybe 40 feet across the ceiling, lost in blackness. In the center stood what looked like a low stone altar, ringed with small piles of bone and carved wooden pieces darkened by time. Some were shaped like animals, others like crude human forms. The smell hit next earthy and sour, mixed with decay. Owen went still beside me. "This isn't natural," he said quietly. As the team fanned out, Clean motioned me over to one side of the basin. 2 more bodies lay there, half buried under collapsed debris. The skulls were intact enough to see signs of blunt trauma. A torn sleeve still clung to one of the bones. We took samples photographs and then stepped back. I watched Theo kneel, his gloved hand trembling above the earth. He didn't touch them, just bowed his head for a long time. When he finally stood, his voice was barely a whisper. "If these are them," she's still deeper. Later, while the others worked, I found something half wedged between the stones near the dais. A small notebook page, water-stained, the writing barely visible. But under the beam of my flashlight, I could make out a few words written in blue ink. They took me deeper. "It's sacred." That was all. The paper tore when I lifted it. I sealed the fragment in a bag, labeling it with the time and location, but in truth the words had already burned themselves into memory. By dusk, the air outside had cooled the sky, bruised purple over the horizon. The camp lights flickered on one by one, each little pool of yellow in the dark. We gathered at the mess table, weary and silent. Clean wrote in his log, the scratching of his pen the only sound. When he finally looked up, his eyes were rimmed with red. "We'll need another descent," he said. "Deeper this time. If the structure continues, it might connect to a lower system." Owen nodded, but I saw the hesitation behind it. "We'll need better gear," he said, "and maybe a priest." That night I sat outside the tent watching the canyon floor vanish into shadow. Somewhere below the cave, mouth gaped open, invisible but alive in my mind. You spend enough time in places like that, and you start to feel the weight of the earth differently, not as ground beneath you, but as something breathing just slow enough that you mistake it for stillness. I thought of Serena lying in that hospital bed miles away, saying the same thing again and again. They were protecting something. I didn't know what she meant, and part of me wasn't sure I wanted to. Around midnight, one of the young rangers came running up the slope out of breath. "You need to see this," he said. He led us to the edge of the ridge overlooking the canyon. Down below, near the mouth of the cave, a single figure moved across the rock, tall, broad-shouldered walking, with that same uneven gait we'd seen in the prints. We watched it for maybe 10 seconds before it slipped into the shadows and vanished. No sound, no trace. Just gone. The radio hissed with static as Owen called for lights, but by the time the beams reached the spot, there was nothing to find. He swore under his breath, not from fear, but from the deep frustration of a man who likes answers and wasn't getting any. We waited another hour, scanning every crevice until our eyes ached, but the night gave us nothing back. When the wind picked up again, carrying that strange hum through the canyon, I found myself thinking of Etta Kane and her quiet plea. Bring him home. I didn't know if that was still possible, but I knew one thing. Whatever was moving in that darkness had been there long before us, and it wasn't finished being found. By dawn, the ridge looked the same as it always had, but I felt different. The desert hadn't changed. We had. Somewhere below, among bones and carvings and words written in a dying hand, was a truth we weren't ready for. And before the sun set again, we'd be going back down to meet it. The morning after that sighting, the ridge was hushed in a way I hadn't heard before. No chatter from the crew, no hum of the generator, not even the usual wind whistling through the sage. Just the kind of stillness that makes your pulse sound loud in your ears. The air smelled faintly of ozone and wet dust, though there hadn't been any rain. Owen stood by the edge of the drop-off, his thermos untouched, watching the light crawl down the far wall of the canyon. "We're going back in," he said finally, "and this time we go until there's nowhere left to go." Nobody argued. We were already past the point of turning back. By midday, the new team had assembled a mix of cavers, 2 anthropologists from the university, a pair of biologists, and Theo Blake, again hollow-eyed but resolute. He carried his sister's compass looped to his belt, Clean coordinated the descent. His tone clipped his face drawn tight under the brim of his hat. As I secured the last harness, I felt that low tremor in the ground again, the kind you only notice when you stop moving. It wasn't thunder, not this deep inland. It was the mountain breathing or remembering. The first 100 feet were the same as before. Narrow passages streaked with mineral veins, the smell of clay, thick and wet. But past the chamber where we'd found the bones, the floor sloped into a tunnel that hadn't been mapped yet. The beam from my headlamp caught the shimmer of water trickling along the rock, gathering into shallow pools. The air cooled the farther we went, the light behind us shrinking until it was swallowed whole. Someone said it felt like walking into a lung, every sound dampened, every breath amplified. They weren't wrong. The tunnel opened into a wide cavern, the largest yet. The ceiling was lost to darkness, and the air carried a faint hum like electricity buried in the walls. In the center stood a mound of stones arranged in deliberate stacks, 5 of them uneven but intentional. Between them were objects we hadn't seen before. Carved wood, polished bones, a few scraps of fabric that looked like they belonged to modern gear. I recognized the green from the type of jacket the group had worn in their photos. The anthropologist, Dr. Morrow, moved forward, brushing her fingers over one of the carvings. "This isn't random," she said. "It's an altar." Her voice was barely above a whisper. The beam from Theo's flashlight swung to the far corner, catching a faint glint. He moved closer, and the rest of us followed. Half buried under a drift of silt was a body intact but shrunken, as though time itself had folded it inward. Her name tag was still visible through the grime. Nova. No one spoke. Theo fell to his knees, his breath hitching, but no tears coming. Owen crouched beside him, one hand on his shoulder. The rest of us stood back, the air too heavy for words. She looked almost peaceful. Her hands crossed over her chest, something small clasped between them. I leaned in enough to see it, a carved figure, smooth from touch, shaped like a human, but not quite. The features were stretched, the proportions off, like an echo of what we were. There were no wounds, no sign of violence. The biologist, Dr. Ortiz, examined the body with quiet precision. She didn't die from injury, he said. Starvation, maybe. Illness. Then he pointed to the garland around her neck, woven from dried moss and some fibrous plant we couldn't identify. This was placed. A burial, not an accident. The deeper we looked, the clearer it became. This was no den, no lair. It was a place of ceremony. Along the walls, faint patterns emerged under our lights, repeating symbols carved in a language no one recognized. Circles within circles, handprints layered over time, and among them silhouettes tall and narrow, neither animal nor human. It wasn't the first time I'd seen something in the rock that made me feel small. But this was different. This felt alive, as if the stone itself remembered every hand that had touched it. While the scientists documented the scene, I noticed footprints leading away from the body, large spaced wide, pointing toward another passage veiled in darkness. I called Owen over. We followed the tracks a few yards before the light picked up movement ahead, a flicker like heat distortion. We froze. It wasn't a trick of the lamps. Something tall shifted just beyond the beam and slipped behind a curtain of stone. We heard it breathing steady, deep, not hurried, like it was watching us and waiting for us to decide whether to come closer. Owen's hand went to his radio, but he didn't press the button. "Let's not test it," he murmured. We backed away slow, never turning our backs. When we returned to the chamber, the air felt thicker, the glow from the fungal patches on the walls dimming as if responding to us. Dr. Patel collected a sample from one of the glowing clusters and sealed it in a vial. "These spores are ancient," she said. "Whatever's living down here has been doing it a very long time." I believed her. The smell alone told me we were standing in a world that had existed long before we ever put names on maps. As we prepared to move Nova's remains, Theo found her notebook wedged between two stones. Most of the pages were waterlogged. The ink bled into unreadable stains, but the last entry was clear enough to make the hair rise on my arms. "They're afraid. Something's coming. I won't leave them." Her handwriting slanted downward like it was written in a hurry. Clean read it twice, then folded the page carefully into his coat pocket. "We'll take her home," he said quietly. By the time we reached the surface, night had already fallen. The stars looked impossibly sharp, as if we were seeing them from a higher place than before. The wind cut across the ridge, carrying the desert's dry chill. We set Nova's body down in the transport shroud, the carved figure still resting against her hand. Theo knelt beside her, whispering something only she was meant to hear. When he stood, he handed me her compass. "She'd want you to keep it," he said. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded and slipped it into my pocket. Back at camp, the scientists worked under floodlights. Samples, photographs, sketches, it all went into the record. I sat off to the side, staring at the cave mouth. It looked ordinary again, just a black gap in the rock. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't left alone. Owen must have felt it too, because he kept glancing over his shoulder, the muscles in his jaw tight. Around midnight, he called it for the night, told everyone to rest. But none of us really did. The wind carried strange echoes, low tones that sounded almost like voices. Maybe it was just the canyon, or maybe not. The next morning, the lab reports came through the field radio. The soil and biological samples showed genetic material that didn't match any known catalog. The microbes were ancient, but the hair fragments, those were new, human-shaped but not human. Hybrid markers, Dr. Patel said over the static. Something between. The camp went quiet after that. Even Clean didn't have a word for it. He just closed his notebook and stared toward the canyon like he was waiting for it to blink first. When we flew Nova's body out by helicopter that afternoon, I stood on the edge of the landing zone, watching the dust swirl up into the blades. Theo lifted a hand in silent thanks as the helicopter banked east toward the horizon. Once it was gone, the sound of the rotors faded into nothing, and the desert settled back into its old rhythm as if nothing had ever disturbed it. But when I looked down at the canyon, I could still see faint movement in the shadows near the entrance. Just a ripple, maybe heat, maybe something else. Morning broke slow and colorless the day we went back down. The ridge was quiet, except for the rattle of our harness clips and the soft scuff of boots on stone. No one said it out loud, but we all knew this would be the last descent. The scientists from Salt Lake had set up their temporary lab beside the vehicle's rows of metal cases, each tagged and numbered. Behind them, the canyon opened like a wound we couldn't close. I remember the smell of rope damp and metallic as I clipped my line to the anchor. The air was cooler than the day before, almost sweet, and for a strange moment I caught myself thinking how peaceful it might have been if not for what waited below. We reached the lower tunnel just before noon. Our headlamps caught the same carved figures we'd passed before, but now the lines looked deeper. Somehow, their edges freshened by the touch of our own light. The deeper we went, the more the air thickened. You could taste minerals like licking iron. At about 200 feet in the path, dropped again, and the walls began to shimmer faintly. That's when we saw it, a glow ahead, pale blue, like moonlight trapped under glass. When we stepped into that chamber, every sound died. It wasn't just silence. It was a kind of listening. The space opened wide around us, bigger than any we'd seen, and there in the center lay what we'd come for. Nova Blake, her body seated upright against the wall, head bowed slightly forward as if in thought. A garland of cave moss circled her neck, woven with small stones and bits of bone. There were no wounds, no sign of struggle, only the stillness of someone who'd already made peace with whatever came next. In her hand she held a small figure carved from wood, the same shape we'd found near the altar above. I remember Owen lowering his head, his hand on the brim of his hat. "She wasn't a prisoner," he murmured. "She was part of them." Theo moved forward slowly, flashlight trembling. He knelt beside her but didn't touch. I could hear him trying to steady his breath. "She stayed," he whispered almost to himself. "They must have kept her alive longer." The others worked in silence, photographing, measuring, mapping every inch. Near her right hand lay a stone blade, hafted to bone, its handle etched with the same markings from the altar chamber. It looked both ancient and recent, like something remade again and again by different hands. While the others documented, I walked to the far wall. There, carved into the rock, was a series of symbols, loops, and crosses, lines curling into spirals. Between them, faint scratches that looked like letters NB 2007. The date hit me hard. It meant she'd survived almost 2 years after the others were gone. I took one step back, the beam of my light trembling across the marks, and for a moment I felt sure she'd carved them, knowing someone would find them someday. Not soon, just someday. We gathered what evidence we could. Samples of the fungi that lit the walls, fibers from the garland air from the chamber itself. No one spoke of the footprints we found near the edge, bare, human-sized, but broad, leading back into another tunnel that narrowed into blackness. We didn't follow them. Some things you learn don't need chasing. By the time we surfaced, the wind had shifted east, carrying that sharp desert chill that comes before night. The camp had grown quiet, a different kind of quiet than before, no longer searching, just waiting for permission to rest. When we radioed in the confirmation, there was no cheer, no applause, only stillness. I looked at Theo standing at the canyon's edge, staring down where we'd just been. His face was wet with sweat and tears, and I thought about how grief can look exactly like exhaustion. The next days blurred together transport reports, the transfer of remains. The scientists ran tests on every sample, every scrap of evidence. Their early findings made headlines across the country: microbial strains not found in surface ecosystems, hair fragments with DNA that mapped halfway between human and something else. Half the experts called it contamination, the other half called it a revelation. For us on the ground, it didn't change much. We already knew we'd found proof of something we didn't understand, and maybe weren't meant to. Serena stayed in the hospital through most of that summer. I visited once before she was discharged. Her body had healed, but her eyes carried that faraway look of someone who had left part of herself in another world. She told me she didn't remember the escape clearly, only the flood, the sound of stone cracking, and the light when she finally saw the sky again. "They saved me," she said quietly, "but they couldn't save the rest." She talked about Nova, then how she'd learned their gestures, their rhythms, how the creatures had seen her as something more than human, or maybe just something willing to listen. Before I left, she asked me not to let anyone turn the story into a circus. I promised her I'd try. The government closed the site soon after. They said it was due to geological instability, risk of collapse. That was the official line. In truth, it was about control, about keeping the mystery from turning into a spectacle. The canyon was sealed, the maps redrawn. You can still hike near there, but not close enough to find the old entrance. Sometimes hikers swear they hear sounds carried on the wind, low, rhythmic, like chanting deep underground. Most folks laugh it off. I don't. Months later, the lab results came back final. The DNA fragments were confirmed as hybrid, partly human, partly unknown primate. The story went national for a week, then faded behind the next headline. They called it the Utah Enigma. Scientists argued on talk shows, and cryptid hunters came with cameras and theories. But in Escalante, life went on the same. Tourists still stopped for pie at the diner, and I still opened the ranger office at 8 every morning. Only difference was, I kept one photo on my desk, now the 6 of them at the trailhead sunlight, catching dust in the air, all of them smiling like the world was still whole. By fall, Serena had moved back to Colorado to live with her mother. She started writing a book about survival and the blurred line between myth and truth. When it came out, folks expected horror, but what she gave them was reverence. She called it Echoes from the Deep. I read it cover to cover one night at my kitchen table. Every chapter carried the weight of someone who had seen kindness and terror living in the same breath. Theo set up a foundation in Nova's name, a small non-profit dedicated to exploring unmapped ecosystems responsibly. He came by the station, once dropped off a framed certificate thanking the Park Service for their courage and care. I didn't feel courageous. I felt tired. But I thanked him anyway. As for me, I stayed on until retirement. Every now and then I drive out toward that part of the monument just to sit on the ridge when the light turns red across the rock. The land looks peaceful again, but there are moments when the air dips cold for no reason, or when the canyon seems to hold its breath. It's then that I think of those 6 young, curious, and so human in their belief that the earth was just something to be mapped. I think of Serena, whose story no one fully believed, and of Nova, who became part of the thing she tried to understand. We like to believe every mystery can be solved if we just look hard enough. But I've learned some truths don't want to be dug up. Some belong to the dark where they can't be twisted into entertainment or evidence. That canyon taught me that. It taught me how to listen for what isn't said and how to leave some places untouched. Now and then, I still hear from Marion Hale. She sends a Christmas card every year, always the same message inside. Thank you for keeping watch. I keep them all in a drawer at home. It's a small thing, but it feels right, like a promise kept. The world moved on as it always does. New hikers came through, new names filled the permit logs, new storms carved new scars into the stone. But every time I pass that stretch of road, I slow down. Not to look, but to remember. Because I still see them, the 6 of them, heading out with their packs, the sound of laughter mixing with wind, unaware that the desert was listening. If this story stayed with you, share it not for numbers or noise, but so their names don't vanish like footprints in sand. Because the truth is, the land remembers even when we try to forget. And somewhere beneath those red cliffs, under miles of silence, a story is still breathing.